webinar, why many colleges are abandoning test optional admissions and why you must take the SAT, ACT. The direct impetus for a huge swath of American universities going toward what's called test optional was really COVID. It was 2020. And to be fair, there was really no other alternative. College Board had a lot of trouble getting testing available. Many schools that would normally provide the outlet, the forum for in-person testing, simply didn't have their doors open. It was nearly impossible for more than a year for kids to take tests. It's not fair to ask students to report a test that you couldn't possibly have taken. Now, there were, before COVID, small coterie of progressive colleges, largely liberal arts, that also were test optional for ideological reasons. But test optional became a practical reality in 2020. And the repercussions of this are still being felt today. If you're in a big hurry and you don't really have more than 2 minutes, I can summarize this entire conversation. Many colleges are ending the test optional policy. And for the life of test optional, quite frankly, the tests were never really, truly optional. I'll explain why I'm saying that. Some of you who've known me for a while know where I'm going to go with this. Columbia, this is their screen when they announced that they were test optional, or rather confirming their test optional. And if you read a little bit carefully, you can see some of the messaging that Columbia and other universities engaged in. If you've studied logic or rhetoric, you might recognize some of the language in Columbia's messaging as what we call straw man. In other words, it's rooted in the belief that students are dynamic, multifaceted individuals who cannot be defined by any single factor. I say that's a straw man because there's no American university that I have ever heard of that only wants to know about this one single factor, the SAT or ACT. Even the most selective universities, in fact, particularly the most selective universities, they've always had a very holistic three-dimensional approach. And the UCs, which until 2020 were very focused on scores and grades and many factors, there was never a score, even a perfect score, that would simply get you in. And often there wasn't a score that would keep you out, depending on what other factors. But this is pretty typical of the messaging. I spoke in 2020, almost immediately when COVID shut things down, to an Ivy League admissions director who had just moved on to another position. And he said some interesting things. They weren't surprising to me, but they may surprise you. He said quite candidly, he asked that I not identify him. He said, look, everybody knows that they're not really optional. And he named some categories of students: good high school students in certain demographics that are what we might call overrepresented. He said, these are just not optional tests for this group of students. And he also said something that, again, didn't surprise me, but it's important that everyone understands this. He said, going test optional will significantly improve our selectivity. I want to make sure you know what he meant by that, because that indeed has been the case across the board. Years ago, almost 20 years ago, I remember going to my first National Association of College Admissions Counselors conference and being struck that the colleges, even the fanciest, Harvard and Stanford, they have a couple-hour session where you can walk around to essentially folding tables with sort of coverings on them and little signboards and literature, and you can talk to colleges and ask questions. I've learned a lot and gained a lot from attending for almost 2 decades those conferences. But I always was struck by the fact that There was another part of the conference that had extraordinarily fancy displays, often $250,000, $300,000 displays. You could play like a kind of simulated skiing game when the conference was in Denver. And these were data companies. These were companies that are selling universities names and information so that they can then hope to encourage students to apply. And these aren't just colleges that are lesser known colleges, colleges that are struggling. University of Chicago, almost 10, 15 years ago, sent t-shirts out to students who had just a little bit above average PSATs. They sent sunglasses, which if you know University of Chicago's campus is kind of a bit misleading. University of Chicago wanted to improve their selectivity. You improve your selectivity not by taking fewer students, but by having more apply. So you reject more students. You take the same number, but you reject more. This makes you, in the eyes of US News, almost instantly a better university. USC jumped from a proprietary private application to a Common App application and added tremendously to the number of applicants. But nothing has added to the number of applicants. Nothing has added to selectivity as much as the test optional policies that began in 2020. A lot of teachers and counselors, I'm not going to pick on any, actually insisted that it's going to be easier to get into universities with these test optional admissions. For a very small segment, it perhaps is a little bit easier. I would say for nearly everyone, and certainly everyone on this webinar, it got tremendously harder to get into selective universities. Yeah, it is not easier. The exact opposite has happened. This is a fairly long-term look at Stanford and Harvard. You can kind of see where that trend is going. But take a look at NYU. NYU is a desirable, marvelous university. They don't really have a campus, but Lower Manhattan is your campus. If you look at this graph, you can see that from 2016 to 2019, the trend is a little up and down. They're getting more applicants, but in 2018, the acceptances actually went up. But around 2020, it drops, and within a few years, the acceptance rate for NYU is cut in half. NYU gets about 26,000 more applicants. This is almost entirely due to the fact that students around the country got the impression that the SAT doesn't really matter. In fact, many media stories, many newspapers simply preach that gospel. The tests don't matter. It's almost effortless to find headlines or NPR stories where people say, well, now that the SAT doesn't matter. And just want to make sure you know that was never really true. This Ivy League admissions director said, no. The tests are not optional except for a tiny slice of people that we're particularly interested in. This trend at NYU is echoed across many schools. Vanderbilt's numbers are sort of headed to 0% acceptance in one sense. The messaging about test optional is, I would say, not honest from colleges. Here's an example of Harvard. Students who do not submit standardized test scores will not be disadvantaged in their application process. I have to tell you, we now know that's simply not true. That is not the case. Students who did not submit standardized test scores were profoundly disadvantaged. We're going to talk about why I would say that in a moment. And when we talk about colleges being honest, they're never entirely honest. They want your application, and they'll do almost anything to get it. And so Pomona is messaging here that philosophically speaking, the choice to submit or not submit test scores is up to the applicant. You're encouraged how to decide best to present yourself. basically, you do you, it won't matter. But I have a client in Los Angeles. I want to make sure I don't accidentally identify her and um, reveal her, but she's very bright, very smart, went to an Ivy League school, is a doctor at a major university in Los Angeles, and her daughter's very smart and talented and is potentially a recruited athlete at a top liberal arts college and a coach at Pomona when this mom explained, well, we're going to send SAT scores, of course, because she's got a 1500. The athletic coach I'm thinking of in an email said, well, we're going to want to see at least a 1530. So I just want you to consider from Pomona, the message on the admissions page is the choice is up to you. It won't make a big difference. And the real story is you need at least a 1530 to be considered even on an athletic recruitment pathway. When colleges talk about test optional, unless you're in a very special category, it's a bit crass, but it's not unlike overhearing in college a boyfriend, girlfriend. You hear the poor boyfriend ask his girlfriend, your birthday's coming up. Should I do anything special? Do you want me to organize a dinner or have a special party for you? And she says, oh, you don't have to make a big deal about it. But we all know if he doesn't make some kind of big deal about it, the phones will be blowing up with what a bad boyfriend. Colleges are not honest in the last couple of years. They certainly have not been in explaining the role that the SAT and ACT play. We have always tried to look at empirical data at Hamilton rather than taking universities at their word. And I want to make sure I give a shout out to Mr. John Pilliser. He's brilliant and incredibly important part of the office. He did a little digging in the very first year or two after COVID and discovered that in many universities, they were, if you pressed, pretty honest about the fact that most of the people are submitting scores. In fact, even at the height of test optional, it looks like about 70% of admitted students to Ivy Leagues and Stanford sent scores in. So, and I would say, pardon me, there are some other, there were some early voices like MIT that said, curiously, MIT read a report by the UC system and used that report largely to change their philosophy about what would be required. So MIT was one of the first of the big gun schools to say we absolutely want the SAT score. Some of you may have possibly encountered this very important article last month in the New York Times. David Leonhardt talks about what he calls the misguided war on the SAT. Until about a month ago, you could only find this point of view in sort of marginal places, not in the New York Times or the Washington Post, maybe in the Wall Street Journal. But David Leonhardt says, I've highlighted this part, that most of the story about standardized tests, that they are unfair, that they're harmful, that they're not good measures of success, that is a false story. It's simply not true. And it's meaningful that Christina Paxson, who's the president of Brown University, if you know much about Brown, it's a pretty liberal, loosey-goosey, wonderful place. She says standardized test scores are much better predictors of success than high school grades. But we go back a year ago and you will get exactly the opposite wisdom being shared in most forums, on NPR, in New York Times, in the Washington Post. This story in the New York Times just from a week or two ago, is talking about the fact that Dartmouth is one of the first of the Ivy Leagues to say we are going back to requiring the SAT and ACT. And if you take a look at sort of the meat of the story, it gets pretty interesting. It says here, a second finding was more surprising. During the pandemic, Dartmouth switched to test optional, and they could either submit or not submit, the applicants. And the researchers discovered that many, from their point of view, lower income students made a strategic mistake in not submitting the SAT, ACT. They wrongly believed that their scores were too low, and their scores, in some cases, if they were 100 or 150 points below an average at Dartmouth, students thought, well, then I'm not at that range, so I might as well just not submit. And four Dartmouth professors actually chimed in here, basically saying, if we see you as in some ways marginalized or disadvantaged, and there's a score in the 1400 range, you definitely should be submitting that score. I will say, get back to my, I will say, what am I doing here? I will say that advice that I've heard from counselors, which is not stupid, it conforms to common sense, and it sounds like this. Don't submit your scores unless they're going to help you. Don't submit your scores unless they're going to be at or above the average of the school. That, sounds like reasonable advice, but in fact, Dartmouth is explaining that that's probably not correct. Scores have a number of purposes, and for some students, scores can show a likelihood of succeeding and not helping the average SAT. I will say, if you are in an overrepresented category, if you are a student in a ethnic demographic that is highly represented in college, and you go to a very competitive, even if it's public high school, you should know lately it seems the SAT number is around a 1550 and the ACT is around a 35 to have a reasonable chance of meeting the expectations of that high-level Ivy plus school. But you should know if you have other factors at work, that number could drop by 100 or 200 points, and not submitting scores is almost always a mistake. Not submitting scores is taking the Fifth Amendment. It doesn't look good. I asked Purdue, I spoke earlier in the week with a Purdue admissions officer, and I asked her point blank, what percentage of students that you admitted in the last year at Purdue submitted test scores? And the number was striking. She said 97% of the students they admitted submitted test scores. I was very curious about the 3%, 97%. Purdue phrased their policy as highly, highly recommend. It's not quite what their website says, because their website wants to make sure that people apply. More people apply, more rejections, more selectivity, a better position in the US News ranking. Okay, so if test optional for most of my students is not really a thing, I sometimes have students tell me, but I'm only applying to the UC campuses, which are test blind, so I don't need these tests. That sounds like a truly terrifying scenario to say, I'll just apply to the UCs, and I'll try to explain why. This is a freshman admissions profile from 2018 for Berkeley. you can see that it was pretty tough. 15% acceptance rate, roughly speaking, 89,000 people applying to Berkeley. But you could see back in the day, about 5 years ago, maybe six, that if you had above a 4.0, this was special GPA that the UCs would create called the UC GPA or eligibility GPA. They weight some, but not all of your APs and honors, and they look at 10th and 11th grade classes. If you were a 4.2, 4.3, you were about 25% likely to get into Berkeley. And if you had a 3.8, you could see you were 3.7%. You could see that your ACT score, if it was very strong in the 30s, you had about a 25% chance of getting in, and it pretty much drops in half every sort of step down the ladder. You could see that San Diego, for many students, would be likely 55% likely to get in, and you see the same with your ACT scores. I used to show this kind of chart to hundreds of students, and with it, you could build a reasonable, rational, well, these are my reaches. If Berkeley rejects 75% of the people who are perfect, it's a reach. San Diego accepts a little more than half, it's a target. And we could see other UCs where you could be pretty sure you were very likely to get in based on the numbers. So I want you to consider the UCs stopped publishing this data. What I'm showing you is the very last instance where the UCs made this sort of transparent freshman profile available. The admissions, I would say, for the UCs is now largely opaque. I want us to talk a little bit about why that is. The UCs did two crucial things in 2018. They initiated a 2-year study of the SAT and ACT. They released it in 2020. I have it here. It is well worn and dog-eared. And they began advocating for Proposition 16, which was an effort to reverse Proposition 209. Prop 209 was an effort to remove identity, race, gender from admissions in the UCs. The UCs felt that the time was right to reintroduce that kind of legislation. As most of you know, to the surprise of the UCs and some politicos in California, even though California is an extraordinarily liberal state, a larger proportion of Californians than in the 1996 Prop 209 vote decided they didn't want their children to be judged by race and identity. They wanted them to be judged independent of those factors. And that's probably why when the UC system released their study of the SAT and ACT, they wanted to answer 3 questions. Does the test predict who will be successful, or would grades be better? Is it fair, or does it give advantages to wealthy students or students based on identity issues? And should we keep it? The task force concluded the UC should not go test optional. The task force concluded the SAT and ACT are significantly better predictors. That is, in fact, what almost all the Ivy Leagues have discovered independently. The task force discovered that at least the test prep that they investigated didn't really seem to offer an advantage to students. I'll explain why I think we're quite different. Many of you know why we're different. But poor kids who have a library card and practice math do well on these tests. And very wealthy kids whose mothers are celebrities, if they just spend their time on Instagram, they don't do well on the ACT. And then the mother, as you may have read, has to go to prison because she cheated to get a better score. If being wealthy was all it took, every wealthy kid would have a good score. The committee recommended that they should continue using the SAT, and they didn't find that the SAT plays a major role in worsening disparities. In fact, this is what Ivy Leagues have found. In fact, MIT, I didn't allow you enough time to read it. MIT made great efforts in their blog post to explain diversity has improved using the SAT and ACT. So it may surprise some of you to realize the regents, when they voted, utterly contradicted the 51 UC Senate faculty who read the report and said, we should keep using the tests. The regents decided they did not want to use the tests. And I'll let people argue about the dynamics of that decision. Certainly, we want a UC system that doesn't exclude unfairly students who've had fewer advantages. But I would have to say the current UC system has created some truly bizarre, and I would say unfair results. This is a chart showing UCLA's admissions data from 2018 to 2023. I just want you to notice they had about 114,000 students apply in 2018 and 111 apply in 2019 and 109 in 2020. So it was actually going down a little bit. So what happened in 2021? What happened in 2021 is the UC said we are test blind. You can apply without sending any scores. In fact, we won't look at your scores at all. And by 2022, UCLA had 150,000 applicants. The UCs, like Berkeley and UCLA, added 40,000 applicants almost overnight simply by eliminating testing, by being test blind. And as many of you know, one problem with this is that grading regimes across California, the standards, the criteria that we use to assign grades are profoundly different from school district to school district, from school within a school in a district, and even within certain teachers. I don't want to name names, but some schools and some teachers surrounding this office, they're very rigorous and they ensure that students are well prepared for college. But many will have a hard time getting into college if they want to go to the UCs, because the new standard for the UCs is essentially a perfect or near perfect GPA. And even then, that doesn't make you remotely likely to get in. I'm going to try to give you a couple examples. The UC campuses in going test blind killed two birds with one stone. They did get more underrepresented students, although I will point out they've quite appropriately bragged that they have, for the last 15 years, the most diverse public universities in the nation. But they also got more applicants and thus greater selectivity. Yes, Berkeley and UCLA have risen in the US News rankings, and the ways you measure success in a college admissions environment is selectivity, which means how many you reject. So I just want you to consider with this new admissions, which one of these two students do you think got into UC San Diego? I just want you to take a quick look at this. One 4.4, 1590 on the SAT. ISEF, that's International Science and Engineering Fair. USACO is a computer science competition. AIME is a math competition. This person engaged in pretty extraordinary leadership. Both of these students I know personally. Student 2 has a 4.1 GPA, a few Bs, but mostly As. No SAT. We administered in the office of PSAT. The score was a 780, which is pretty low, and no real activities. As you can guess, in this instance, student 2 is the one who got into UC San Diego. I will tell you, student 1 wanted to study computer science, and she is at MIT. as a freshman studying computer science. That's a pretty tough, um, that's a pretty tough thing to get. UC Riverside told student one um, that she was accepted, but not for her first choice major because computer science was, of course, an impacted major. So I just want you to consider um, it's very hard to predict who will get into the UCs if you look at traditional measures of a reach, a target, a safety. Is Riverside not a safety for someone with this resume? And if you're thinking, well, maybe she didn't do a good job with her essays, you don't get into MIT unless they find you charming, brilliant, um, uh, all that. Um, in 2016, Westview High School had an acceptance rate to Berkeley of 44%. 44% of the students who applied to Berkeley got a yes. And I want you to think about these numbers as acceptance rates for 2021. If you are sensing how this game is played, it wasn't 41% who got in a few years later in 2021. It wasn't 22%, it wasn't 13, it was 6.7%. I now regularly have students who get into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and are rejected by nearly all the UCs, and in some cases, all of the Cal States. And if you're wondering how could that be, well, why not? If the Cal States don't want essays and the Cal States don't want scores, um, uh, why is your perfect GPA any better than someone else's perfect GPA? And for the UCs, although there are essays, a UC admissions reader is typically paid at the highest level, about $2.50 per application. And there's 3,000 to 4,000 words if you read the essay and the application and the activities and you read the transcript. And most people read 300 to 400 words per minute. You'd make below minimum wage if you actually read them. More applications, 40,000 more applications, 25 to 35,000 more applications on average for top private schools means full-time professional admissions people are not reading the applications as primary readers anymore. It's being farmed out to hourly part-time people, and they have a different set of sensibilities that has changed the game. For the UCs, the reason you can't say, well, I'm only applying to the UCs, so I don't need to take the SAT and ACT. The reason I think that's a terrible idea is you cannot look at the UCs and say, this is a target, this is a safety, this is a reach. They are wildly unpredictable, and that is almost certainly by design. The UCs want a greater representation of the ethnic geography of California, and that is a tremendously important goal for them. I do know some faculty at the UCs that have told me that in engineering at UC San Diego, there used to be 0 students who were in the freshman class who had not had pre-calc and needed a pre-calc class in college. And then a couple years ago, suddenly there were 300 students admitted around 2021. Last year, there were about 900 who had not had any pre-calc. Again, there's different ways of viewing that, but I'll let you come to whatever conclusions you will. I just want to make sure people know the reason you need to take the SAT and ACT in this context is you cannot tell yourself realistically, well, I will just apply to the UCs. Students who are at Stanford were rejected by all the UCs. And if you're thinking, well, there's yield protection. Some students are just so good that UC Irvine would know they wouldn't come. The student I'm thinking of and many others were also rejected by Berkeley and rejected by UCLA. You need to take the SAT and ACT because you cannot apply only to the UCs. And nearly all other universities either require scores or when they're optional, it's the Purdue model. 97% of those applying are going to submit scores. Um, um, I am going to talk just a little bit about what we propose to do to help people in this situation. For many years, for 25 years, I've taught the SAT and ACT, and starting in 2016, I built a program that we call H3 that prepares people for the SAT and the ACT, and in so doing, also the PSAT, because I have a lot of students who are well positioned to do well enough on the PSAT that they could be a national merit semifinalist or finalist. Your tuition will be cut in half for a school like USC. By the way, USC's acceptance rate, given the test optional model, has shrunk to now 9%. And for engineering programs at USC, appear to be somewhere between 2 and 4%. And by the way, although the trend is absolutely for Ivy Leagues to be going back to requiring the tests, Yale just made some noise saying they're pretty likely going to do that. The Ivies can afford to go back to requiring testing because they're not too worried about their position. But I would predict, if I had to, that many other schools will hold on to test optional because it is a way of getting 25, 30, 35,000 more applications. Maybe applications that don't really, certainly if they sent them in without scores, that don't have a great chance, according to what we've been reading about Dartmouth's decision. But I want to emphasize in the last in the most recent iteration of the SAT has gone to a digital format. And I want to explain a little bit how that matters and what that means. We have extensive experience teaching online in a digital capacity. When COVID took hold, we taught 550 students online in a digital fashion and ended up with dozens of perfect SATs. I would even say we're pioneers in teaching distance and online. I do believe because the digital SAT is so different in some ways in the way it will interact with students, but is so similar in the skills that have always been offered, we're very well positioned to teach this test. We have a digital platform, and we have 12 digital SATs that you can practice with, and about 1,000 practice questions on top of those. And I'll tell you in a moment why I think you should still be using a model where you study for the SAT and the ACT if you have the luxury of studying in the summer with more time. But please do take a look at our schedule, and we'll try to explain why we think in a private appointment this is the best approach. One reason we think this is we've already had students get perfect PSATs on the digital PSAT. The digital PSAT was the first real live practice with the digital SAT. And our students who we trained last summer, many of them got literally perfect scores on that test. My concerns about the digital SAT, and I've shared them with people, are that the digital SAT has been engineered to fit on a screen. So Marshall McLuhan, the famous 20th century intellectual, worried about screens. And I think most responsible people today have some concerns about screens. Ironically, we're on screens right now. We live our lives on screens. And the SAT is hoping to compete with the SAT by moving to a digital format where students will take the test on screens. But to accommodate that change in medium, the SAT, the digital SAT looks quite different. This is the classic SAT, a reading passage. This happens to be from James Dickey's novel Deliverance, and a bunch of questions about something that probably took you 5 or 10 minutes to read. This is a sample of the new digital SAT. this is pretty much the longest chunk of text that you will encounter. But you are also asked to do the same things, to talk about main idea, but you might get another paragraph with a graph and multiple choice questions. All of this is tailored to fit on screens. Now, there's a vocab component on the new SAT. This, as some of you know, gets me a little bit excited. I was very sad when the SAT eliminated the vocabulary elements in 2016. Well, it is back, and it's about 18 to 20% of the total score points on the SAT. So we have much experience teaching vocabulary. This is going to be a huge advantage for our students. But and there's also significant grammar. Simply put, the digital SAT was designed to fit on a screen and designed to compete with the ACT, to be a more palatable, amenable product for teenagers. And it may have some advantages for some students. The digital SAT seems to be a little gentler on time. And it will also reward students who put in some effort in mastering vocabulary. But I would point out the new digital SAT has a few odd, puzzling quirks. The new digital SAT, you cannot take it home. You have to take your laptop into a school. This would almost be like getting a Netflix account, but then you have to bring in your computer to Sinopolis to sit and watch your Netflix show. It seems to have many of the disadvantages of digital and few of the advantages. I'm also worried that in making these passages very short, but giving you more of them to fit on a screen, that we're kind of speeding along some of the cultural trends which change the way young people process information and think about things. The NAEP exams that measure national progress in reading and math tell a sad story. Almost all metrics and scores show basic skills in reading and math are in a pretty stark decline. I don't think the SAT can single-handedly fix this, but I think asking students to read only a paragraph doesn't help that trend. I'm also curious about the fact that myopia and associated retinal degeneration and even retinal detachment is becoming almost an epidemic. Students are on screens too much. College Board wants them to be on screens more. That said, we have completely redesigned our summer and fall and spring programs to be able to teach the SAT digital test in an entirely digital format, but we can do it long distance, we can do it online, or we can, of course, do it in person, which I think most people find is the best way to learn. Will the new digital SAT be easier? I've had students ask this. I mean, it's shorter, yes. No, it's not going to be easier. I'll tell you why. It's simply going to be different. First of all, people said that the SAT that's now a thing of the past, the one issued in 2016, would be easier because it didn't have vocab. But the SAT and ACT both, they are designed to not like a driver's test where if you don't have to parallel park or you can miss a few more, you pass or you fail. The SAT and ACT put people on a normal distribution curve. I am confident on the new SAT, there'll be 1% in the top 1%. And if there are fewer, if there are shorter questions, but more of them, it certainly appears that the new SAT has a more ferocious scale. There are more opportunities on an ACT, for instance, to answer grammar questions and more opportunities to show your knowledge of reading. But on the ACT, if you miss a couple, you could still get a literally perfect score on the ACT. On the SAT, the scales that we've seen so far suggest a very cruel scale. So it looks easy, but your score will plummet if you make one or two mistakes, which is one reason why we strongly recommend, since the skills are identical, that when students have the luxury of a little bit more time, you let us introduce you to both of these tests. And from extensive personal experience, I can promise you, we've learned a lot about teaching these two tests together. This set of headlines shows 17 students in Nebraska who in a year earned a perfect ACT score, and they have interviews. One of them is going to be the next Warren Buffett, apparently. And I'm showing you the San Diego Union Tribune headline from, I think, 2015. This represents all of the students in San Diego in a year. Two of them are Hamilton students, by the way. All of the students in a year who got a perfect ACT back in 2015. We began teaching the SAT and ACT together in 2016, and we call those classes H3, SAT, ACT, PSAT. Our first year of teaching the ACT alongside the SAT, we had several perfect SAT scores, but we had 43 perfect ACT scores. I want to show you, oh, by the way, this says 209 perfect scores. It's now 211. Two people yesterday contacted us and said they got perfect scores. If you ask what percentage of these perfect scores come from people who get a perfect score on the ACT, it's the highlighted scores. It is 87% of our perfect scores. So the reason we want you to strongly consider preparing for both tests is that you are 10 times more likely to get a perfect score on the ACT. And with the scale of the SAT, you need to make sure you have a good day. In fact, kind of a perfect day. But we want to prepare you for the digital SAT because we know some people will find the test with enough practice a better fit, while others will find the ACT a better fit. How do you find what shoes will fit you? You try them both on. And we will let you essentially walk around in these shoes all summer, and you might find both pairs work pretty well. By the way, this highlighted chunk of students is not only the proportion that have ACTs, it also represents more or less the proportion of students who did in-person live classes. We have many options for test prep for the new digital SAT, including, especially for people outside of San Diego, online tutoring, because this test is digital. But I want to emphasize the personal interaction of a small class group is something that almost every metric in the United States suggests was deeply missed in the last couple of years of COVID. I teach many of the critical reading classes in San Diego. I teach them personally. I don't teach the classes that go out to the broader nation and international students we have. I also want to point out that as there's an increasingly profound understanding that grades alone are bad predictors of success. And again, it's awkward, but certain high schools in San Diego, a very bright student could have many Bs, 7, 8, or 9 Bs in some instances. Metrics like the SAT and AP exams are increasingly important. Please consider letting us help you prepare for any of these exams. And please consider my primary message, which is to borrow the words of an Ivy League admissions director at the very beginning of COVID. Test optional, not really optional. Many Ivy Leagues are now openly confessing that many students should have submitted scores, and there's a general cultural shift to understanding that grades are not the best way to measure who will likely to be successful. They're one piece, and we put all those pieces together, including testing, test scores. You've got um, a winning combination. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment and see. I'm just going to look at a question and see if it's not too sensitive to answer. Okay, someone says this. From my understanding, UCs get around the test blind by seeing how many APs were taken and what scores received, which again can also show privilege in and of itself. No, I don't think that's correct. First of all, I agree. Yes, if that was what they were doing, it would just be another form of so-called privilege. But the UCs, I've got friends who are readers. They don't do that. They're not just using the APs as a proxy. There are test prep companies that I think have somewhat misleadingly given that impression, but no, it's for students in high schools that have a lot of hard AP classes and they're very challenging. It's unfortunately a little more unpleasant than that reality. It's not that they'll use APs instead of test scores. It is that the UCs simply want more students from certain zip codes and fewer from others. There is no metric. There is no metric that will give the UCs what they want. They do not want the most abundantly qualified. They want the most diverse and equitable group of students. And it's a conversation for all Californians to have about the merits or the pitfalls of that method. But you do need to know you can't count on getting into a UC, no matter how perfect you are. Someone is asking, if a kid has a mix of A's and B's, but has fives in all AP exams, will the lower grade get compensated by high AP scores? Well, in my experience, which is considerable in some um, college environments, even at the very top, yes, but not in the UCs. In the UCs, they really don't want to see more than a handful of Bs. And they will not use APs as a counterbalance or counterweight. However, some very strong schools in computer science and engineering look at students through an entirely different lens. Not that it's easy to get into an engineering or computer science program at Purdue or University of Illinois. The acceptance rates hover around 4%. But in our office, the acceptance rate for those schools last year was not 4 to 5%. It was about 80%, largely because there are colleges that are going to look at a student and think, look, some B's, but look at how many APs and look at the AP scores. You just need to know which colleges are using what we might call a more sort of merit-driven model and which ones are using more of an identity or hardship model. For some of my students, one of those models is going to be kinder than the other. Someone says, what are the primary 3 things that students can do or control beyond GPA and test scores that can make a student more competitive to Ivy League schools? Well, the emphasis here is, of course, can do or control, because many of the factors are beyond your control. But I'm going to say, as real estate agents say, location, location, location. The 3 primary things you can do is impact, impact, and I'll maybe amend that a little, and insight. If you have impact, if you have truly created impact in your world, in our world, in your community, if you really have left an imprint in a powerful way, and you pair that with insight, that is understanding who the readers of these essays are, then you have you have a decent chance at Ivy League schools. We had double digits last year into Stanford. I can't find one of those happy students who didn't have both of those things, impact and insight. Many who've spoken with me know um, there's no place at a school like Yale or Harvard for someone that says, I'm a very good boy or very good girl. I did everything I was told to do. They want to know, what did you do that no one told you to do? And often help 8th, ninth, and 10th grade students understand what those things might be, but it's different for every student. Someone is asking, how many or too many SAT tests? This is a really good question. The ACT will only report scores that you explicitly request to have sent. So colleges, no matter what their policy, will only know about the ACTs that you want them to know about. The SAT has a different policy. They let colleges have a little more say in um, uh, which of your SATs they get to look at. Yale wants to see all of them, and other schools like Harvard say, send us the ones you like. I would say 3 is definitely not too many, but when you get beyond maybe 4, I worry you might be focused on the wrong things. Although I have had students on their 5th attempt, that's the score that they needed. But I think if you prep properly, if you prep responsibly, if you prep at the right time with the skills in place to do well, you don't need to take it 5 times. You might need to take it twice or maybe 3 times. I think when people take it more than 3 or 4 times, they often are taking it too early, and they're taking it um, thinking it's a lottery scratcher. It's not. It's like preparing for a marathon. You know what your training was. You know whether you're ready. These were excellent questions, and I want to thank everyone um, for their time. And please let me mention my email is Chris Hamilton, at Hamilton Education. You can also email info at Hamilton Education if you want to argue with me or correct me, or you want more information. Um, um, and please read the stories that I've shared and alluded to in this webinar, because they reveal something that Mr. Pilasser and I have been saying for several years. Test optional is not really an option. And it is these tests that will show that that you are ready. And they will often show things that say more than your grades. Someone is asking if UC schools worry about their reputation because they are very likely admitting people that are less, this is a delicately chosen phrase, compatible, with the rigor of the school. It's an excellent question. And no, I don't think they worry about it. I think they worry that somebody, maybe somebody like me, will write an article or an editorial and show some of what's happening. Because I think what's happening is there are students who are very recent immigrants who happen to live in good zip codes and often do so at great effort by the family. And those students are being punished. I think because the UCs are being rewarded for being more selective, it will take a long time for the general public to understand what's really happening in terms of like engineering students arriving at the UCs and not having had the second year. Um, Someone is asking about good restaurants in TJ that I've visited recently. I have not been to TJ recently. I would say finally, I think the trend, I hope I'm wrong, but I think the trend is going to be the very top elite schools will give up test optional and be more honest about their expectations. But I think that many schools just a notch below that bump of getting 25 or 30,000 more applicants, I think they're going to have a hard time giving that up. In almost every way, colleges flirt. They send t-shirts, they send sunglasses, they send messages. UC Irvine, I don't know if it's still there, you go to their bot and you ask a question, what majors are impacted at UC Irvine? The answer that UC Irvine gives you is none. Good news, none. And then they tell you the most highly selected majors, and then they name the impacted majors. I mean, universities want more applications. Found it a bit ironic that when you have more than you could ever need, more than you could possibly accommodate, and you still want more, somehow that pattern of behavior is expressed in the language of equity. Whatever equity is, I don't think. Someone's asking what grade should students take. Most people should probably prepare in between 10th and 11th. I really like the summer because I get students who their brains are different. They're sleeping, they're ready. I'm going to make them read. My motto is over prepare. And if you could find anybody in the world who has a 10th of the number of perfect scores that we have, let me know. I'm most proud of the kids that go up 500 points and have a new set of possibilities. My wife and I were at dinner at Market Restaurant at the bar, and just a couple weeks ago, a young woman named Samantha, didn't recognize her. She's back in the day, 2012. She had a tote though that said Harvard Law Review, and she was with some friends. And about 20 minutes in, this quiet voice, this girl, Samantha, says, "Mr. Hamilton, is that you?" And I said, "Yeah." And she just wanted to remind me that she went up 800 points on the SAT, got into UC San Diego, even though she came from not as strong a high school as some other students. She graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. And yeah, she went to Harvard Law, and she's now partner track at Latham Watkins. I believe people can get better at things by working and studying. And I believe we've developed a very strong record of helping people get better by teaching fundamental skills. That's what most studies on the SAT, it's what they miss. When they look at average test prep, it doesn't look like it actually helps to spend a little money, which is one reason why the tests are not as unfair as some people have said. And what we do is teach fundamentals, teach reading, writing, grammar. And I will admit, it takes a little time and effort. I think it's helpful if you've finished pre-calc, definitely helpful if you've finished Algebra 2. If you have not, IM 2 is usually enough, or Algebra 2 would be preferable. There's no real formula for how many AP classes to take for IVs. You should be in the dozen or 2 dozen students taking the most, but you have to not take more than you can handle. All right, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't end this. Thank you all very much for your time and for your questions. I wish a good evening to everyone.